MacAskill.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate the member and indeed others who have also contributed and agree entirely with the comments and sentiments. I think there's two aspects I want to comment on upon this. The first is the question of self-disconnection and the second is the issue of prepayment meters. Firstly, let me deal with self-disconnection. I have to say I'm a child of the 60s. I think all families, because it was almost universal then, remember strictures to switch off lights, remember directions to ensure that every appliance was switched off unless it required to remain on, such as a fridge. The sense of self-disconnection just never was mentioned. It's only arisen with the energy crisis. And let's be quite clear, it is a euphemism that masks something that is frankly quite appalling. We have other such euphemisms. We've had the question and the topic of legitimate targets put forward when usually civilians, civil servants, part-time police officers, actually usually farmers who did it in their spare time, or even customs officers were murdered by terrorists, and they were described as legitimate targets. It takes away the horror of it. We see it even from governments. We've had illegal wars, we've had collateral damage. No, sorry, it wasn't collateral damage. It was the murder of families going to prayer or going to a wedding or whatever else. And now we have self-disconnection. It sounds very benign. Who could possibly disagree with self-disconnection? What's the harm in self-disconnection if somebody chooses to manage their budget? What we're talking about with the phraseology of self-disconnection is somebody, through the financial circumstances imposed upon them by the cost of living crisis and by energy price rises, all of which are within the control and domain of government, that is causing significant hardship, albeit that they are having that done by themselves because they have literally no alternative. So this self-disconnection has to move on. It's a government choice and that has to be changed and it has to be addressed. Let me then move on to the question of prepayment meters, because this cold snap that we're living in is affecting everybody. There won't be anybody who's not looking at if they possess a smart meter and looking with some surprise, many with a lot of horror and some with abject misery at just what the bill is showing as the meter rises before their very eyes. But let's also be clear that it's not simply a question of heating. That is fundamental in the cold snap that we have at the moment. And it's not simply a question that's almost posed about people having this insidious choice between heating and eating. It's also about access to power. Because if you're on electricity and you have to self-disconnect, as the euphemism says, then what is that also affecting? It's affecting the ability to have a fridge on. The ability to maintain a fridge allows you to buy food cheaper and to keep it longer, so it affects your quality of life. It's about the mother, or indeed somebody even going to employment, who wants to wash their clothes, to look smart, to ensure their children aren't picked upon at school, who aren't able to turn on the washing machine. Because anybody with a smart meter knows how fast it ratchets up when you put on the washing machine. It goes beyond that as well, because it's access to power that provides the access to the phone, or indeed to the iPad, to try and allow your child to improve themselves, or indeed that phone that you require to obtain employment, and even, perversely, you require that phone sometimes on some occasions to be able to top up your prepayment meter. If you can't even get access to that, how can you deal with it? And as others have mentioned, it also fundamentally affects life, because it affects the ability, if you actually have to have some power that's required for your health. The fundamental matter is dialysis. The numbers are few, but there should be no basis upon which anybody who has a higher health requirement that is, should require to have a prepayment meter. I know that the word is put about that that is not normally what happens, but we all know from the charities that it does happen and it has to change. So that's why it's important. And what are the numbers that we're dealing with? We're not talking about a handful of individuals. In Scotland, it's 500,000 prepayment meters. That's almost a fifth of our people. It's slightly less in the United Kingdom as a whole. It's 4 million there. So we're not talking about the odd person in the odd street. We're talking about whole areas, certainly in multiple deprivation, that are forced into this matter, and that's something that has to be dealt with. Smart meters should be liberated. Technology is meant to advance our society. It should be. It has in many instances. Access to the internet has been beneficial, even though we all know with social media there's a downside. But 13% of smart meters are now on a prepayment tariff. That is simply unacceptable. That is bringing in a wrong, it is perpetuating a wrong, it is using technology that should simplify and actually make the system fairer, it is actually making it worse. No smart meter should be going on to that prepayment tariff as such that I'll come on to. So that's the situation there. I do agree with the comments made by the Honourable Member for Glasgow North. I don't think that it's prepayment meters per se that the issue. It's the higher standing charges and the higher tariff that applies. There is an argument that you can have that there is a need for prepayment meters. Those who are private landlords really do want them. And I can understand that in those circumstances it's acceptable. Some public landlords would also say that they would prefer them. And that, themselves, is not an issue. It also is the case that some people would even prefer it to manage their own budget. And again, that is something that I might advise or counsel them against, but they should be able to take that option if they so wish after such advice. What is entirely unacceptable is the higher standing charges and the higher tariff that applies. That is simply perverse, that those who have least, because invariably those on prepayment meters are those who have least and who are most vulnerable, should pay more. That must end. I have spoken to the major utility companies. Now, previously in prepayment meters, they used to bung it all to Utilita. They almost had a matter in this. Now that we're moving on to smart meters, it goes much wider and across the board. They do accept that it would be perfectly reasonable and perfectly easily within the technology that we have to change everybody to the same tariff. Or indeed, we actually should have a social tariff. That's a separate issue for another day, but a social tariff that applies in much of Europe should apply to the poor and the most vulnerable here. But there certainly should be no increased tariff for those on prepayment meters. Can it be done within the current technology? Yes. At most, it would mean a very modest, minor increase for the rest of us on credit. That is the maximum issue that would be faced by those companies that are providing it. If that is the case, if that has to be, then so be it. I am my brother's keeper as we come to the Christmas festive period. We do have a taxation system who those have most pay most. And if it did mean a very minor increase for those on credit, then so be it. There are other ways through windfall taxes and others that we can remedy it. That is what has to be done. That's why this euphemism of self-disconnection has to be killed once and for all. That is not a phrase that we should accept. That is enforced austerity, poverty, misery, and sometimes even death. And equally, in terms of prepayment meters, we have to ensure that higher standing charges, higher tariffs are ended. It can be done. It's within the scope of Ofgem. I have asked them, and they say that they are a creature of statute, which they are. They can only act on the basis of a ministerial direction. How do we end that scandal of a higher standing charge and a higher prepayment tariff? The Minister writes a letter now to Ofgem and says, change it. Ofgem would then invoke it and the solution would be solved. I urge the Minister to do that. Hear, hear.